Okay, so I think we'll start with the first session. So we're very lucky to have Jason Baehr, who's a professor of philosophy at LMU with us. Jason quite literally wrote the book on educating virtuous intellectual character. His book came out 2 or 3 years ago with Harvard University Press. And it's like the canonical work on the methodology and the theory behind educating virtuous intellectual character. And so we're delighted that he's been so centrally involved in the Anteater Virtues project. We're also delighted that he's here today to do a keynote talk for this morning, which is on civility to intellectual virtue.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thanks for all of you for taking the time. So my topic, as the title suggests, is civility in public discourse. And my aim for these next 20-25 minutes is modest. What I hope to do is formulate and say a little bit to try to motivate a certain possibility or question. And in the background is the assumption, which I'm assuming you'll grant me, that our public discourse is badly degraded, toxic even. And a natural response to that that we're seeing in spades right now is the call to greater civility. But calls to civility invite various objections that I think need to be taken seriously. So the question I'd like to consider is, what if we were to conceive of civil discourse as intellectually virtuous discourse? Might this put us in a better position to address some of the more problematic features of our public discourse, and to do so in a way that isn't susceptible, or is maybe less susceptible at least, to some of the familiar worries about civility in this domain? To make very clear, not even remotely implying or suggesting that this would be a total solution to the problem of incivility. Clearly, there need to be various systemic measures pursued as well to make any significant headway on this problem. But I'll be focusing on the sort of individual, personal dimension of the problem, such as it is. Okay. So what I'd like to begin by doing is pinpointing some of the more troubling and problematic features of public discourse today. I'll call attention to 3 features in particular. Maybe. So, here. All right, so it's not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay. The first is a tendency to ignore or distort competing perspectives and counter-evidence. Here I'm thinking of ways in which we neglect the nuance or complexity of an issue, draw hasty generalizations, disregard the limits and problems of our own perspectives, ignore counter-evidence, and so on. I might think of this as a problem with how we think or handle evidence in the context of public discourse. A second problematic feature is related to the first, partly because of the kind of poor epistemic conduct just noted. We also tend to demonize and vilify people who hold opposing views. We regard said persons as beyond the pale or as unworthy of our basic recognition or regard. I think of this as kind of a problem of representation. How do we represent the other to ourselves? A third problematic feature also follows from the preceding two, to the extent that we regard persons who deeply disagree with us as demons or villains, we are more likely to express hatred and contempt in our interactions with them, which sometimes tragically boils over into violence. Think of this as kind of a moral or practical failing. These 3 features hardly exist the ways in which our public discourse is polluted and degraded, yet were they to vanish, I take it that the quality of this discourse would be much improved. So what's the proper response to this rather depressing state of affairs? As noted, one natural impulse is to call for higher levels of civility in how we speak and disagree with each other. Surely there's something right about this impulse. At least two of the three features just noted seem patently uncivil. If so, why not think of greater civility as a fitting antidote? In response, I'll briefly identify two sets of worries about this proposal, both of which are wrapped up with the concern that civility is objectionably soft. The first is that higher levels of civility in public discourse are made possible only at the expense of truth and related epistemic goods, the free flowing of which is essential to a healthy democracy. It's no secret that our epistemic ecosystem is polluted with egregious lies and misinformation. However, calling attention to the offending agents, which is important to do if we hope to neutralize them, can be a rather messy and impolite affair. As such, it can be an affront to civility as it is sometimes understood. Similarly, inasmuch as civility compels us to refrain from expressing or defending views that might prove offensive or hurtful to others, it can pose a threat to freedom of speech, a constitutional right, an important mechanism for identifying and upholding truth in a liberal democracy. Finally, a concern with civility may disincentivize the speaking of truth to power. Civility, the argument goes, is non-disruptive. Thus, it tends to favor preserving rather than challenging the status quo. Speaking truth to power, however, can be highly disruptive. It is often precisely a way of challenging societal norms. A second and immediately related set of worries concerns an apparent tension between civility and justice. We just noted that norms of civility tend to favor the status quo. However, often enough, societal norms are unjust, and sometimes profoundly so. Thus, as has been pointed out at length by Alex Amelin and others, appeals to civility are a familiar way of clinging to power unjustly held or acquired. Calls to civility can also discourage the experience and expression of powerful moral emotions, like anger, bitterness, and resentment. Loud, angry protests, for instance, are deemed by some a violation of civility. Where anger and related emotions are morally justified, as they often are, calls to civility function as an instrument of injustice. Again, the question I'd like to consider with you is whether, if we were to think of civil discourse as intellectually virtuous discourse, calls to civility might be helpful for mitigating some of the more problematic features of public discourse and doing so in a way that sidesteps some of the problems just noted. To get a sense of these things, more needs to be said about intellectual virtues and their bearing on public discourse. Intellectual virtues are the personal or agential qualities needed for the successful pursuit and transmission of knowledge. Qualities like curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual humility, intellectual courage, and intellectual perseverance. On one fairly widespread way of thinking about these qualities, they share a common motivational core, namely a desire for or commitment to distinctively epistemic goods like truth, knowledge, and understanding. As James Montmarquet has noted, they are, quote, the character traits a truth-desiring person should want to have. What then would intellectually virtuous public discourse look like? Depending on the situation, it might look like asking thoughtful questions, curiosity, giving honest and serious consideration to an opposing viewpoint, open-mindedness, or admitting the limitations of one's perspective or evidence base, intellectual humility. It might also, though, look like having the courage of one's convictions, being willing to think for oneself, intellectual autonomy, or persisting in one's effort to know or understand, intellectual tenacity, perseverance. While I don't have time to say much more about the concrete substance of intellectually virtuous public discourse, it may be worth calling attention to what John Stuart Mill described as, quote, the real morality of public discussion, which I think goes a significant way toward capturing the spirit, if not the substance, of the operation of intellectual virtues in the domain of public discussion and debate. In a famous passage from On Liberty, Mill says, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that. nor is it enough that he should hear the arguments of adversaries from his own teachers. That is not the way to do justice to the arguments or bring them into real contact with his own mind. He must be able to hear them from persons who actually believe them, who defend them in earnest and do their very utmost for them. He must know them in their most plausible and persuasive form. He must feel the whole force of the difficulty which the true view of the subject matter has to encounter and dispose of. Else he will never really possess himself of the portion of truth which meets and removes that difficulty. This is a lofty ideal, to be sure, but it is also, I take it, an idea that resonates given how sharply it contrasts with public discourse as we know it. In any case, we can see in Mill's remarks a call to a wide range of intellectual virtues, such as open-mindedness, fair-mindedness, curiosity, and intellectual thoroughness, perseverance, patience, courage, honesty, integrity, charity, and humility. Suppose then that we were to think of civil discourse as intellectually virtuous discourse. Might calls for greater civility help mitigate some of the more problematic features of our public discourse? And how would they fare vis-a-vis the concerns that such calls are too soft and a potential enemy of truth and justice? I'll take these questions in turn, so I'm just going back to some of the slides and features and worries that we noted. It should be clear enough that intellectually virtuous public discourse would be relatively free of the first problematic feature noted earlier, which was a tendency to ignore or distort competing perspectives or counter-evidence by, for instance, neglecting nuance, drawing hasty generalizations, disregarding the limits and problems of one's own perspective, ignoring counter-evidence, and so on. Such behavior is characteristic of intellectual vices, like dogmatism and intellectual hastiness, arrogance, and dishonesty. Intellectually virtuous public discourse, by contrast, would be marked by contrary qualities like open-mindedness and intellectual carefulness, humility, and honesty. A similar point applies in connection with the familiar tendency to demonize or vilify our intellectual opponents, that is, of representing them to ourselves or others as morally wicked or beyond the pale. Here as well, it's difficult to imagine that intellectually virtuous epistemic engagement would leave much room for the kind of intellectual activity in question. While some people may be genuinely wicked, I'll wager that our tendency to predicate such wickedness is often an immediate or downstream consequence of less than virtuous thinking, for instance, of jumping to conclusions, a willful lack of imagination, selective attention to available evidence, and so on. Most, if not all of which, would be mitigated by an exercise of virtues like intellectual carefulness, integrity, humility, and fair-mindedness. The connection between intellectual virtue and the third problematic feature is less straightforward. Consider the hatred, vitriol, and violence that are too common in public discourse. Notably, the contrary of this kind of behavior would seem to be characteristic of moral virtues like kindness, gentleness, empathy, or compassion. So I think of intellectually virtuous conduct as a relevant antidote. To see the connection, we need only remind ourselves that no small amount of the hatred and violence in question trades on a view of the other as wicked or beyond the pale, and that such construals themselves tend to emerge from thinking that is patently intellectually vicious. Therefore, to the extent that this behavior is a consequence of intellectually vicious thinking and conduct, we can expect higher levels of intellectually virtuous thinking to result in lower levels of hatred, vitriol, and violence in the public square. We've considered some reasons for thinking that if we were to conceive of civil discourse as intellectually virtuous discourse, then calls to civility might be helpful for addressing some of the worst and most toxic features of our public conversations. However, even if this is correct, it doesn't yet demonstrate that the suggested formulation or characterization of civility is superior to other, more familiar characterizations that link civility to qualities like kindness, gentleness, and politeness. Or at least with respect to the second and third problematic features discussed earlier, these more familiar formulations might fare just as well. They also would discourage demonization, hatred, and violence. What we need to consider then is whether an intellectual virtues account of civility might be less susceptible to the softness objection noted above. That is, whether civil discourse understood in this way might work at cross purposes with values like truth and justice. I'll begin with the truth-related concerns. Recall that intellectual virtues aim at the successful pursuit and transmission of knowledge, which includes an element of truth or true belief. As such, a virtue-theoretic approach to civility, in contrast with other, more familiar approaches, favors, doesn't discourage, speaking truth to power. This can be a way of transmitting truth or knowledge. Moreover, if something like Mill's vision of public discourse is a worthy ideal, the approach also demands a high regard for the freedom of speech. Finally, intellectually virtuous discourse needn't involve any special concern for politeness, which, as we've noted, can lead to the suppression of truth. Or it is quite possible to be intellectually fair, honest, and careful in one's engagement with an interlocutor, while also doing or saying things that might be considered gruff, discourteous, rude, alarming, or otherwise impolite. Provided that the impoliteness in question isn't expressive of intellectual vices, it is likely to be compatible with intellectually virtuous discourse. What about the justice-related worries to the effect that civility favors upholding the status quo, even when it is unjust, and that civility discourages the expression of justified moral emotions, like anger or resentment? Here again, a virtue-theoretic account of civility appears to fare quite well. Such an account would not sanction social disruption fueled by dogmatic, closed-minded, or dishonest thinking. Beyond this constraint, however, it would seem to demand little concern for preserving the status quo, at least as such. Similarly, while anger and contempt can be expressed in intellectually vicious activity, and to this extent would be deemed problematic on the present view, it's quite possible to feel angry or indignant at these emotions while thinking and communicating in ways that are careful, fair, patient, honest, and the like. It's not easy, but it's possible. The proposed model of civility appears to sidestep the thrust of the softness objective. There is, however, variation of this worry that warrants our attention. Virtues like curiosity, open-mindedness, and intellectual humility themselves betray a kind of intellectual or epistemic softness. And it may be tempting to think that to endorse the model of civility proposed here, one would have to endorse exercising or manifesting these and related qualities in any and every dialectical context, which seems problematic when it comes to engaging with persons who hold wildly implausible views, such as a flat earther or a white supremacist. While raising a reasonable question, this worry turns on a mistaken way of thinking about the demands of intellectual virtue. To hold that a person possesses a given intellectual virtue V is not to hold that they will positively manifest or exercise V in every possible epistemic context. Rather, it is to maintain that the person will reliably manifest or exercise V in situations in which doing so would be appropriate. For present purposes, we can think of an exercise of intellectual virtue as appropriate. Matters are a little bit more complex than this, but we can think roughly that an exercise of intellectual virtue is appropriate relative to a given situation, provided that the exercise would likely prove epistemic. Applied to the cases in question, this principle strongly suggests that intellectually virtuous discourse will not encourage to show much curiosity, open-mindedness, or intellectual humility when conversing, say, with a flat earther or a white supremacist. It's not to say that the contrary of those qualities would be justified, but rather the other virtues would take precedence at this point, such as intellectual caution, courage, autonomy, so on. I propose that it may be worthwhile to conceive of civil discourse as intellectually virtuous discourse, and that were we to do so, it might make sense to think of increased levels of civility as helpful for mitigating some of the more problematic features of our public discourse. and helpful in a way that doesn't incur some of the epistemic and moral costs often associated with appeals to civility. While this is at best a partial remedy, and while much more could and should be said by way of explanation and justification for this proposal, suppose for a moment that it's correct. We might then wonder, what can be done to encourage or equip citizens to engage in intellectually virtuous public discourse? Where and how might this kind of intellectual formation take place? These are also massive and complex questions about which I can say next to nothing here. I would, however, like to gesture in a certain direction, namely at institutions of formal education. As the personal or agential qualities central to the pursuit and transmission of knowledge, intellectual virtues are highly relevant to academic teaching and learning. Indeed, schools and classrooms are an ideal location for encouraging and supporting students' practice of virtues like curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual humility, and intellectual courage. Given that most schools, whether K-12 or post-secondary, have academic teaching and learning as their central aim, I propose that they may be ideal venues in which to provide the kind of intellectual formation that we can now recognize as critical to civic engagement and responsibility. This is not a new idea. While the relatively recent emergence of virtue epistemology has provided us with linguistic and conceptual resources to develop a richer and more concrete understanding of educating for virtuous intellectual character, education theorists have long upheld the importance of fostering the habits of mind we've been concerned with, habits that bear on academic learning and the public exchange of ideas. Here's Dewey on this point. While it is not the business of education to prove every statement made, it is its business to cultivate deep-seated and effective habits of discriminating tested beliefs from mere assertions, guesses, and opinions, to develop a lively, sincere, and open-minded preference for conclusions that are properly grounded. No matter how much an individual knows, as a matter of hearsay and information, if he has not attitudes and habits of this sort, he is not intellectually educated. Again, let's just imagine for a minute that Dewey's right. What I hope we're now in a position to see is the possibility that educating for virtuous intellectual character, while essential to what Dewey refers to as an intellectual education, is also a form of civic education, one that seems especially timely and relevant given our rather fraught social and political milieu. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jason. Questions?
So thank you very much. Very interesting, very stimulating talk. So I want to, it affects my research, but I want to talk about, or I want to ask you about what can a teacher do? So like, if that's a goal of education.
Yeah.
What can we do? What should we do? What are we doing? What are we not doing?
Really hard for me to be succinct in response to this question, but I'll try. One, I think we need to create well-designed and well-supported opportunities for students to practice the activities characteristic of these virtues. So each of these virtues has a characteristic expression or activity. You could compare it to a skill. We develop skills partly through practice. So we need to create frequent opportunities for our students to practice these virtues. We also need to create environment and classroom and institutional environments that are conducive to and incentivize this practice. And then I think that we need obviously to model these virtues in our own thinking and teaching with students. That's as concise as I can get.
Good. I may have more on that.
Please, I'd like to talk more. Yeah, there's much more that could be said for sure.
If I could ask a follow-up to that, I mean, you mentioned the particular milieu in which we're trying to educate, and of course, we don't educate in a vacuum. So the students that come to us have certain entrenched, maybe very highly entrenched attitudes. So to what extent do you think there's actually like maybe an in principle problem in trying to educate a virtuous intellectual character insofar as you're in a milieu which is essentially opposed to that?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not easy work. And it raises the question for me about like what would success at these efforts look like? And I'm a realist about these things, and yet I'm not despairing. I mean, maybe success is going to just, in many instances, look like just undoing some of those bad habits, right? We shouldn't be expecting to educate exemplars of intellectual virtue, but if we can just create an alternative, help students see the value of it, and give them opportunities to sort of go against the grain, I think that is a form of success. I will say, in my own experience with this, that just acquainting students with the language and basic concepts of intellectual character and intellectual virtue can be really powerful, because we tend to think of character as all about how are we as neighbors or as citizens, and then we think of like what it is to think well in terms of skill, ability, knowledge, but there's this entire space between those two other dimensions of our psychology that is a matter of character, or it's a matter of what we value, what our attitudes are, our desires, our emotions and feelings. But it's our character as it relates to epistemic ends and values. So helping students to see that there is a dimension of character that's highly relevant to thinking and learning and public discourse, and to just give them the words and give them examples of intellectual virtues. Again, in my experience, every semester I see a lot of light bulbs go off to say, oh, and with teachers as well, you've given me words to describe something I already care about, something I'm already trying to do.
Yeah, and picking up on that note, did I jump in?
Yeah, please do.
Character. I mean, I think Dewey here is picking up on Aristotle's use of habits.
Yeah.
Right, ethike. And but people come to us with different habits.
Yes.
Different ethikes, different moral characters. And one might read Dewey here and say that his is a leftist, a liberal moral character, open-minded preference, testing beliefs. Why do I need to test that which I hold dear, right? And so if we're thinking about the Civitas, where we all come together, how do we hold in tension people whose characters differ from ours?
Yeah, yeah. And differ in precisely the sort of partisan way maybe that you're alluding to, for sure. I mean, that's a really hard problem. I'll just say two quick things about it. I mean, one is to just concede and recognize that humility and open-mindedness aren't all there is to virtuous intellectual character. That autonomy and courage and perseverance are part of that picture as well. But I suppose my best attempt at sort of trying to find some common ground would be to note that intellectual virtues, at least as I'm thinking about them, are again, you can call them attitudes, skills, character traits, that we have reason to believe are useful for reaching the truth and avoiding error. And so if we share that goal, we may be able to make some progress toward recognizing a common set of virtues. Now, of course, there's going to be questions about, well, what's the better way to achieve that goal, right? And there will be differences and partisan differences. At a certain level, I'm not sure what to do about that, but I think there's actually an advantage of some of these virtue concepts. It could be, it's maybe equally a disadvantage, but they can be sort of fleshed out and understood in different ways. And they, different perspectives can prioritize different virtues. I think that can keep us at some level sort of on the same page, but I think obviously that can just in some ways further underscore the worry that you've got. Last thing I'll just quickly say is that, again, in my experience dealing with a variety of students along these dimensions, in the appropriate space, I feel like when we can model some of these virtues for our students, that they can see the sort of the attractiveness and power of that, and maybe pulled a little bit away from some of their sort of hardened partisan worries about these things, whether it's about courage or whether it's about open-mindedness.
Michael.
So I don't know if I'm going to say this well, but it follows on Mark's question and your answer. I think it kind of something I've been thinking about lately is, and when you frame it with the intellectual virtues, there's a weird, left and right have changed in their definition, and the partisanness has changed. Just since I started paying attention to politics, which was very late in my life. I ignored it for most of it. And in the intellectual honesty sort of side of things, I think there is a value in staking in the ground, independent of left and right, what the university is about. And if you truly don't think open-mindedness is anywhere in your framework, you may just not want to come here, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Right? Like, but if you're, so it's less about left and right, and it is about framing it as these are the intellectual virtues and the habits and the mindset. This is what's going to happen at the university. And I think one of the tensions is actually a little different, is we've declared our value to be, we're going to get you a better job than anyone else.
Yeah.
Right? And we're open to everyone who wants to get a better job.
Yeah.
We have publicly declared that. We as faculty may not have, but the universities have.
Yeah.
Right? That's how we get people here. And so there's that tension between, okay, I'm just coming here to get a better job. Why are you messing with my beliefs?
Yeah.
Right? Give me the skills to get a better job. Versus, this is a place where we believe this statement up here.
Yeah.
And so I think I think this is also a good framework for us to clearly articulate to those who want to come and pay us money.
Yeah.
This is what you're going to get if you pay us money.
Yeah.
You don't have to come here and pay us
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
And I think there's a space to both have conservative and liberal, right and left views in the intellectual framework, just not completely non-open-minded views, like completely. Like, but to your point, you can nuance which virtue you focus on. I don't know, that's kind of the reaction I hear to this conversation.
Yeah, right. I appreciate that a lot. You've narrowed our focus to like how to think about these things in the context of a university.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe that explains why in my experience, I haven't had a lot of resistance, because I tend to introduce these qualities as the qualities that we need to learn well, right? And that doesn't, they bought into learning, we hope, or in theory at least, maybe for purely instrumental reasons. But it turns out that these qualities that are necessary for intellectual competence and mastery, if practiced in these other domains, might be useful. The other thing that comes to my mind is to look at, I think the study of intellectual vices can be powerful, right? It's hard to find someone who really advocates for dogmatism and narrow-mindedness and intellectual dishonesty, right? Now, who we predicate those of, it gets tricky, right? But that can, I'm just thinking, how do we get people in on roughly a similar page? And I think part of that rhetorically can happen through a sort of recognition that, look, we don't want to instantiate the contrary of these qualities.
Last question, Sharon.
Sorry, I can see how intellectual virtue can help in situations like you mentioned where like it gets you to be more open-minded, less dogmatic about your perspective, so that can lead to more civil discourse. When dealing with those situations, like let's say you're confronted with white supremacy,
Yeah.
how does intellectual virtue really help make the discourse more civil there? Because if you're not being more, if you're not expected to be more open-minded in that situation, how does that lead to civility?
Well, certainly there are temptations for many of us in those contexts to think and engage in less than intellectually virtuous or morally virtuous ways. So minimally, I'll just say I think that if look, it's one thing for me to say I'm going to be sort of actively open-minded with the white supremacists, and I'm gonna foreground my intellectual humility, right? Of course, we don't want to do that, but that doesn't mean that I should be sort of or need to be intellectually arrogant or thoroughgoingly closed-minded, right? I can foreground other virtues while also, not violating some minimal constraints on humility and open-mindedness. So I do think it has bearing on those contexts, even these other softer virtues we're talking about. But yeah, I think the main way that virtues are going to show up there might be intellectual courage, or it might be a kind of intellectual autonomy. Now, does that help civility? That's a good point. Probably not, but I'd like to think it's not. Well, depending on how we define civility, I'd like to think that it'd be consistent with it. Okay.
Is it a quick question, Dave? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, it was just like, how does emotion fit into this? I think
Yeah.
it's related to the
Yeah,
question.
I think it's a big part of it.
It's
and
a
I think
big,
it's,
yeah, because it seems like,
absolutely.
sort of like you might be arguing like you can logic yourself out of
No,
hatred,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And it feels like humans don't work that way.
No,
Like
exactly.
we get stuck on
Exactly.
loops of hatred or
Precisely.
resentment.
I think that's a reason why, especially when it comes to sort of the educational aspect of this, why so much attention needs to be paid to what's the environment, what's the relationship, what's being modeled, where a lot of that is more social emotional than it is purely cognitive or intellectual. So I think that a further spelling out of some of this would need to pay very close attention to the emotional and affective dimensions of these things.
Okay, thanks very much, Jason. It was excellent.